instructions for your territory, but it doesn't make sense. But I just like
I feel like I'm trying to without tripping over all the chords. Okay, we have something special for you today. I want everybody to welcome Tarn Adams. We've got a talk about how the emergent narrative system in Dwarf Fortress interfaces with the whole design process and all of that. I will be taking, there's a bunch of people watching on stream, so I'll be taking Q&A from them, but also from all of you. We'll probably prioritize the people in the room because I can hear you a little bit better, but I will try and take as many questions from the stream as we can. And with that, I will let you get started.
Okay. So I'm Tarn Adams. I work with a game. I work on a game called Dwarf Fortress with my brother Zach. We've been working on it for the last 17 years or so. And if you haven't seen it, here's a picture of the world in Dwarf Fortress. So Dwarf Fortress aspires to be a fantasy world simulator, right? You go through the history of this place over, this is all procedurally generated maps, no stories or anything written by us, but everything just kind of moves through this historical process over a few hundred years or longer if you can handle it. I think Jacob from the department has the record with 10,000 something years or something. He left it for quite a long time. So we let the player assume some role in this world and play through it, set it down, play another role, and you just kind of build up a new history and stories that you're kind of seeing yourself here. But in practice, what we've got is not like tons of roles that you can play. There's this settlement management game with these dwarves. There's a little happy face dwarves there in their settlement with their little bedrooms and the mining they do. You can indirectly assign them jobs, and they go off and do them, and then deal with dwarfy things like finding ore and trading and being attacked by critters and so forth. There's also kind of a Proto Rpg in here. I wouldn't, by any stretch of the imagination, call it an actual full-fledged RPG at this point, but you can play one character, run around the entire world. It just lets you experience more of the map and talk to more people. And if you don't want to do any of that at all, you can just play Legends mode, right? You can just look at the history of the world. Some people just use this to play the game. It's just a list of historical events. There are various mods and utilities people use to kind of get a better picture than what we've been able to present ourselves, and can run like tabletop campaigns inspired by these things and so forth. So that's the basic game. So when I said there's no sort of handwritten narrative to the game, it's worse than that, right? We have no handwritten characters at all. No sort of designed items and things that people have come up with, and no maps, locations, level designers, or anything, right? So we're left, when we're talking about a story, we're left with just the mechanisms of the game, right? How do you take the mechanics in the game and somehow have this player come in and write a story, right? That's the problem that we were facing when we started Dwarf Fortress. So we're going to try and figure out exactly what's going on there. So when people sometimes talk about this from the outside, they'll say, well, Dwarf Fortress is a very complicated game, right? It's got a lot of stuff in it. There's all these nested mechanisms and so forth. So the stories must come out of the fact that it's complicated, or that we use procedural generation. There's a lot of procedural generation in the game. All this stuff made up, mishmashed around, and somehow the stories come out of that, right? But that's not how it works at all, right? You have all these things. It kind of helps the process along, of course, but this is not sufficient to get you sort of this emergent narrative engine humming. So that's what we're going to talk about. So it's procedural generation. So we'll start with maps and things. This is just to get a feel for how we work, how our basic design process works. We'll talk about the map process, but then we'll move on from there. So Dwarf Fortress maps are big. It's part of the sort of necessity of the game is to have this large space that you're working in. They can have enough variability to tell stories in there, and too big for memory. So it's essentially this infinite space. And so generally how you deal with stuff like that is by using stuff like subdivision, right? Fractals, so that you can generate, you can use a noise function or something to generate a space as you need it, right? As you go, you're looking at a certain part, I can just generate it there. And so you can subdivide, you have features in there, and part of the problem you start to get with this this approach, and you see it in unmodded like Minecraft, is you and in certain features of Dwarf Fortress is you get these columns or whatever, or these squares, and everything has to live within those things, right? There's these veins and rivers and things, but they're localized. And you do get some global features, and you can work this into your fractal algorithms. Like if you take elevation, temperature, rainfall, and drainage, we use that to generate our biome map. And the biome maps looks better than what you get with noise, right? Because it combines 4 different things and then does some post-processing, we may mention a little later, to get you more. But when you think about something like a river, right, it's hard to come up with an algorithm that's going to give you believable rivers flowing downhill that work over arbitrary geography, right, if you have an infinite world. But fortunately, we don't have an infinite world, right? It's simply very large. So when we talk about our subdivisions, we make our map, it's not all stored in memory, but there's an abstraction layer, right? So we can look at, say, a piece of this, and we can set just manually, and you could do this with noise, but we just set manually river crossing points, and then look over the whole map and look at elevation, and look at the rainfall fields, make the river thicker when more water's been flowing down to the end, and so forth, and really can set up a river as we want because we're in a constrained space, and we set up these extra abstraction layers to do it. So that's what happened with the maps there, and you can see it all over them. We have all of these different abstraction levels on the map. We've got the geology layers to make the geology less homogeneous, but also clustered properly, but over wider areas. We've got these site maps so that the sites can be bigger than anything of our fractal subdivisions, and also kind of move around and cross the lines, and just add an extra abstraction layer there to make things look more realistic. So here's one of the towns, for instance, but we zoom in and we look at our subdivisions that we have to deal with when we're loading in actual sections of the map. You'll notice there is one sort of farm plot intersection per 48 by 48 square there. That's just part of the abstraction there. And even the city maps, excuse me, if you look at the subdivision, there's one intersection and none of the buildings cross those lines. If you have this 48 by 48 section, it draws the buildings in there, you put whatever you want in there, but it doesn't cross the lines. So respecting the abstraction level, but generally speaking, the takeaway here, and we're going to talk way less about maps now, is that we add these levels of intermediate data structures and whole mechanics to the game sometimes to solve our problems. If the map is too homogeneous, rivers don't look right, you can add to do these things. This is kind of just a kind of counterpoint to the general design principle that we cut things away and then make our things perfect. This is never going to be perfect. It's never going to be close. So you can sometimes even solve small problems, and we'll see that by adding to them. And so you should, think about your abstraction layers there. We'll see another example here. So something happens. This is a problem that we had, a big problem we had when a dwarf sees something that happens, and they just have this, excuse me, I need a drink or something, but we have this seasonal thought list, and so the dwarf sees something that happens, like they see, here's a door, here's some rat or something I don't like, just walk by my feet. And so you get these plus and minus happiness levels. It adds them up over the season. If their happiness level is too low, they can throw a tantrum, and this is in the old version. And if they throw a tantrum, the problem is when they're running around, starting fist fights, toppling furniture, and throwing things at people, that would decrease the happiness number of every other dwarf around them, right? And that happens in this seasonal thought list. It sums it up, and then there's this effect called the Tantrum Spiral that the players named, where every dwarf is throwing a tantrum, and then the deaths start to happen, and the numbers go down even further, and the game is lost, right? That was just considered at the time a valid way of losing the game. It's like you weren't having enough roasts and things made out of mushrooms and so forth, and not enough fine dining rooms, but it was always a precarious position, and it was also just deeply silly, right? So we addressed this problem by adding a new system, the stress system on top of it, this extra layer where you're not just happy in the moment, but your long-term level of happiness is determined by what's going on in your seasonal thought list. So you can still throw a tantrum, and we just added an extra personality filter there to create more sort of heterogeneity in the results. But if you're throwing a tantrum and you're really upset, that's just going to make other people around you kind of more stressed out, right? But it's not going to necessarily tip them, excuse me, into the next level. Now, all right, thank you. Sorry about the interruption, everybody. Whoops. Oh.
Sponsored by T-Box.
I was out in the way of everything. This works, all right. So, yeah, great. So we've got that solution to the problem. And there's still this issue of homogeneity in the dwarves' reactions. Like they see a thing, oh, I admired this, oh, this thing I saw. But we wanted different reactions, and we wanted more flavor to it. So we added another system where it looks at the personality values relationships, and then they could have different sort of emotional reactions. And then we just glossed the emotions positive, negative, or neutral, and then that would affect the stress level. So it's not too much of an addition other than just attaching emotional reactions filtered through these things. So it's quite a sort of data entry problem or something, but it's not a serious issue. And then the latest thing we did kind of make the get rid of this in the moment effect. This is still all sort of in the seasonal moment. Is we let them remember what happened, and that just led kind of to callbacks, so they can recall things that happened to them, and then the system got more intricate there as we noticed problems with that. And finally, whenever they stored a long-term memory, it actually caused their personality to change. We just threw that in there to give them this feeling of character arcs, right? The character arcs are silly in the game sometimes. Right now, if they get rained on, then it can really affect them. Sometimes they remember for years, and then we're working on continuing to fix this up, and that is an issue when you add stuff to the game. You are creating complexity for yourself. You're creating opportunities for bugs and imbalance and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, we're happier with what we've got now than what we had before. So we think it's better. Another example of this in our sites, right? Sites like a town or a cave with people living in or whatever, the elf forest settlements. So if you want to take these to be elves on the left, dwarves on the right, humans in the middle, that's fine. So we have all these different populations that move around in world generation. It's not just sort of homogeneous by the creature type. They can move around. But the problem, if you want to call it a problem, but it was something kind of noticeable, is that if you pulled a human from any of those places, they were exactly the same. It just pulled it out of the culture definition and said, okay, there's a human from the elf place, here's the human. There's a human from the dwarf place, there's a human. And you pull them up and you get things that are essentially the same. And that was, again, one of these things that was bothering us in this sense of having stories that felt meaningful, felt like there was impact in the history that was going on. So what we did is added another abstraction layer, these things we called Psych cultural identities. And then you can just piggyback a little information around now. You can have drift, so that when the elves get a human population moving to their place, those humans living with them will now start to adopt a few of their values. It just kind of drifts the values over. And then when you generate people, it's not reflected in the great image there, but the people are different from each other. I mean, I guess they're posed differently, but in any case, those people they're literally wearing different things and believing different things. And when you speak to them, they'll do different things, and they'll take on different professions, all that kind of stuff. And if you want to move when you're in this situation, you just have to copy the structure over and then let it drift, right? So it's just a handy little thing. Allows us to say, like, what's the opinion of the government, what's going on with religious. We just did a whole new religious thing for the upcoming release where it tracks the beliefs much more closely within each of these psych-cultural identities. So it was another way of kind of adding some structure to solve a homogeneity problem that we were having in our stories. So looking at just the simulation we've been talking about, I mean, of course you want the things that you add to, it's a simulation, you're trying to contribute to some kind of model. But the important thing about this is that you understand what you're going for in your simulation. You have some kind of intuition, because that's going to help you solve problems with the model when we think, oh, these people are the same, they shouldn't feel the same. Because we were thinking of it that way, it allowed us to kind of solve our way out of the problem. It doesn't mean all the games need to have sort of real world analogs or anything like that. Just some way for you to think about what you're doing. And there's different layers that we're when we add a building block. I've been talking about layering a lot. So it's just kind of the property. But the important thing that I didn't get into here is that when you're thinking of adding things to your simulation, you need to set a high enough sort of abstract level so that you're not adding just a bunch of nonsense to the game. I've not been completely innocent of this one, obviously, but it's something that you'll find a lot, especially when you're talking to people about their first projects. Like, I want to make a racing game and I want to simulate all 50 variables I can think of for the tires, right? It's not a good decision to do that at first. You should do that later. Get a game up and running. So it's important that you try and make the simulation stable. My histories are not stable after 10,000 years. I don't know what Jacob's world was like, except that it had a lot of books written by vampires, and he had a giant vampire library. But it doesn't really matter, right? That's an edge case, and you can correct for it well enough. I mean, you don't have to worry about chaos theory and stuff destroying your. I mean, it will, but you can usually just add in a hard limit. If you don't want the butterfly flapping its wings to cause a typhoon somewhere, you just say no typhoons. And then you're fine. You just kind of test and notice what's wrong and fix it. And sure, we want simulations to be extensible, moddable these days. So this is just thinking about getting a basic simulation up and running, but that's not a story engine yet. You know, we knew we weren't there before when we were talking about complexity and procedural generation. So we talked about, okay, what makes a simulation? Still not there. So what do we need to think about? Well, we haven't thought about stories at all. So let's start thinking about them. I mean, even this river. Right, you can kind of tell we're on the right track. If you do things with that river, like put settlements on it or explore up and down it, because of what we've done so far, it's going to feel more like a river story than just a line of water, right? The elevation works right. It's something we've been thinking about it correctly. So how do you get this story to work with these mechanics? And the thing is that we found that the potential for stories is tied to these mechanics and the way they're connected to each other. It's the way that the mechanics work together. I mean, we've thought about it all different kind of ways. Like, are you arranging like this electric field and the story is like a magnet shooting through it or something? There's a lot. I mean, you kind of get this feel for it, right? And that's not useful in a talk to just say, yes, I have a great feel for mechanics or whatever. So when I was thinking about how to talk about, like, how do you get the story moving through these mechanics, it's kind of like I have the instincts of a mathematician. That was how I was originally brought up. And so we prove things by contradiction a lot, right? We think like, okay, if I break it, what goes wrong? And then I can prove that this result is accurate. So what does it mean when we fail, right? What's going on with the mechanisms in the game when we've completely screwed up our story generator? Like the player's expecting something to happen, it just doesn't happen. Kind of lost this thread they were following. You've thrown too many numbers at them, they can't possibly tell a story about just a spreadsheet, right? Or they can't share it for any of other reasons. It's simply not a story you can tell. The thing has thrown something that was just completely jarring at them, put them in a completely different situation. They're overwhelmed, not necessarily by numbers, but just by content. Overwhelmed, can't tell the story. I was talking a lot about homogeneity in the examples, and that's a huge problem, right? It's kind of this. You've probably seen the Kate Compton bowl of oatmeal thing by now if you've been around here. It's just a huge problem for stories. No one's going to tell a story that they think is boring. And at the same time, it could be too good because it was a handwritten set piece cutscene thing. No one's going to tell that to anyone else, generally, because they might think they're spoiling it, or they think everyone in the game sees this. So I'm not going to just talk about what happened in my quick time event boss fight and talk about what cool stuff was happening in the village that was kind of randomly generated or whatever. So this is a list of challenges. We see in Dwarf Fortress this happened when we were doing academic research in the libraries. When you build a library, the scholars come. In World Generation, there's all kinds of apprenticeships and things. And those people will come to your fortress, write books, and they kind of tie into this whole tavern and traveler system we added at the same time. But the fundamental thing here, the things that they're studying, just because of time constraints and other problems, I mean, they'll discover mathematical things, which is fine, or they'll discover, more importantly, stuff about like hospitals. They'll like discover the invention of the traction bench. Well, the traction bench is already in the game. You can just place it there, whether they discover it or not, which is kind of really bad. But we just didn't have time to hook in this system, so the stories are terrible, right? I mean, it's like it just doesn't contribute to the stories at all. Now, if the dwarf had invented suturing, and then it fixed somebody, that would be a big story moment, right? Because it would tie into the mechanisms that are already over on the right, these items, buildings, hospitals, things happening. Whereas, so it's total kind of failure there. I mean, people still tell these stories occasionally, but they're self-contained over like, oh, some scholars arrived and discovered some stuff. But a system that worked, surprisingly to us, just surprising, not in the sense that we didn't know if it would work or not, it was just off our radar, was sculpture. When you engrave something on the walls, these are in Dwarf Fortress stories all the time. What gets engraved in a bedroom, what gets engraved at the, there's a lot of Dwarf Fortress stories where at the end of the story, the player will pause the game and set up an engraving just so they can have something to kind of memorialize what had just happened and let the dwarves come up with what that is, right? And oftentimes it's sort of compelling what they have to say. And the reason here is because sculpture ties into everything nicely. There's the job of doing it, the history that can be displayed in the engraving can show the historical events, the materials that things are made out of. People get impacted by what if it's in a gem wall or that kind of thing matters. Where you put it, the personality of the dwarf impacts the content that's in the sculpture, right? It all kind of ties together, and so you see them a lot, and that's kind of what you should aim for in designing your systems. The story just kind of runs through there. And as with the academic research, sometimes you run out of time, though, right? We need ways to deal with that. And so what we did in the case of academic research, and we had seen it in a previous project, so we knew we could throw this patch on top of it, is just silly book titles, right? That's really, I mean, you can see the little scroll bar on the bottom right. It's not a giant corpus or whatever, but there's a fair number, and a lot of them I just got from like the math books that were on my wall, removing the algebra, colon whatever, but I do not have a book called Algebra, My Love, or whatever. But so we just put some silly stuff in there, and it works, right? People talk about the book titles all the time, just funny book titles. And just this description, I mean, it'll get you a long way. Just doing exposition, description, talking about things. But it is more compelling when there's a mechanical tie-in. So we have these physical descriptions. People use them to draw their fan art of dwarves and so forth. And so they get the eye color right and that kind of thing. But sort of more notable in the stories are things that tied in mechanically with what's going on. Like, is this dwarf wounded? Does the dwarf have a scar from a previous wound? You can see the age of the dwarf in their physical descriptions, and there's sort of physical attribute stuff in the game that matters, and that comes up a bit more than the others. The items that they're wearing, there's a lot of fluff there. It's all sort of geographically correct fluff, but that hardly means anything to people if they haven't played the adventure game. They wouldn't really know where these things are from and all that kind of thing. But notable in the main mode of the game, the fortress mode, the personal treasures they're carrying, whether or not they've got sutures in their inventory is meaningful. They can have crutches and splints and things. And that's the things that people will notice and put in their stories more often. And then we have this total thing that was just never comes up in stories, and kind of a bad decision to do it this early. Is we added mannerisms to people because we thought, oh, it is a, in the list of things that are types of characterization that you would read about on Wikipedia or something. It's like people, add mannerisms to your characters or whatever. So some years back we threw that in, and no one talks about it. It doesn't really connect mechanically to things. Now, if it was like a tell, if you're lying or something like that, and it mattered when you were talking to somebody, like interrogating them with your sheriff or talking to them in adventure mode or something, then it would matter. But it doesn't right now. So we got nothing out of that. Now compare that to the likes and dislikes system, where they, this one likes rose gold, this one likes to eat a certain kind of food or whatever, and they dislike leeches, and they like a certain kind of beer. That comes up everywhere, and so it comes up everywhere in the stories. And you see a lot of them center around these things. Just the sorts of items they pick out, the sort of room they want to be in, what they're eating and drinking, what kind of animals they should have as pets, all that kind of stuff. Mechanically matters, and so it can just become the core part of a story as you're making decisions, playing through the game. It's also a source of bugs and problems when you have mechanical links to these things. Like right now, our food preferences are often way too specific and sometimes unattainable, like mosquito brains or whatever. Sometimes it picks those out, and we still need to fix that, and hopefully we'll be doing that soon. Now, sort of this idea that the mechanisms drive into the stories, again, you see in just the ability to carve space, like thinking about the spaces in your game and what kind of things the player can do. We allow them to make these taverns or inns. They can name them. They can put workshops and things in them, like the kitchens and the stockpiles and so forth. They can have rooms that are let out. The travelers will come there. And you'll get tons of stories about these as well, because the player understands a space. It's kind of like a house in The Sims or something, right? The more control you give people to set up their spaces, the more they'll talk about them, and the more they'll include them in stories. And the kind of star feature in Dwarf Fortress, of course, is just the ability to mine, right? I mean, people expect that out of dwarves. It's tied into everything in the game. It's in every story. What they dug out, what they found, what kind of disasters there were, when they found water, if they found water, the exact type of spaces they mined out. People expect dwarves to be able to mine, and in fact, this feature is so important that if a story, if a Fortress game doesn't include mining, then that's going to occur in the story, right? Because they'll be like, I decided to make a bunch of cabins in the woods without mining when I was playing Dwarf Fortress, and that's notable. When they do that, or I'm living on the tundra trying to stay outside or whatever, trying to do a glacier embark or whatever. So it's finding this kind of key features. I mean, it's something that should be apparent when you design a game, but sometimes you'll miss them. And this is just kind of a key demonstration of the kind of simulation narrative tie that we're talking about. And it's also important because the fact that people see dwarves as mining is kind of an expectation they were bringing to the table ahead of time, and really helps with accessibility, like in the sense of having resonant themes, things that people will tell stories about. I mean, the universal theme is kind of a silly thing to say unless you're talking about dying or something, but I mean, obviously that's a big part of the game. But they'll tell stories about things like that. So if you're thinking about, I want to make a game that's a story engine, people are going to pass stories around, then you should think about the types of stories they're going to be telling and whether or not you have included anything like that in your game. As we've been talking about, you want the mechanics in the game, when you add a new system, a new building block to the story engine, you want it to mesh with the existing mechanics in the game in a narrative fashion, right? That reinforces the narrative. You can just write stories down. This is something that we do quite a bit. Just write down a paragraph and say, like, could I tell the story in this game? If I can't tell this little story in the game, what's missing? What mechanics are in here, and why do they work together? And other things, like if your story includes dialogue, you're going to get into a lot of trouble because it's just hard. These are hard problems, but sometimes they're not. And you can write a story, or think about why am I not getting these kinds of stories, and patch up the holes. That's again testing your simulation against your intuition, but now it's more like a story intuition. And as we saw with the likes and dislikes, and even the way the player in was displayed, the player needs to be able to see the things that they're doing in the game. They need to get feedback. We'll talk about that quite a bit more when you add in the story engine, and involving the user as much as you can, kind of entangling them in what you're doing. There's this kind of general game design principle about providing people with interesting choices and not wasting their time, that kind of thing. And in the case of emergent narrative games, that can be further extended to kind of get them sort of conceptually linked in the space. I mean, one of the big things in Dwarf Fortress is just that the dwarves have names. This is not something that was common back when we started. It was in, obviously, some games. There are some games like The Sims and Tropico and stuff where they had named characters and so forth. It was basically required to get this kind of thing to work, otherwise people have to come up with a shorthand and nicknames for things and stuff, and it's just not as easy to tell stories. So, but we're not there yet. So we have this sort of story engine, right? That's creating these stories. If we do all these things, obviously we're starting to get some kind of stories popping out of this. Except like, why is it like what is going on? It's not a game yet. Where's the player, right? So let's think about the player to make this into a game. So there's a lot of different ways to conceptualize players and human-computer interaction, all that stuff, and we're not trying to reinvent any of that here. But just generally speaking, you could be playing in Dwarf Fortress. You play a single character, or you're kind of controlling more indirectly the action, or you're just looking around and seeing what's going on. Like in Legends mode, right? We have these descriptions of battles, for instance, where it talks about in a little too much detail, apparently, what's going on in this battle that happened. The player can go look at things. Like I said before, some people just interact with the game in this fashion, but the important thing to point out here is kind of the fact that the player is investigating, right? They're allowed to investigate details because when they're telling a story, sometimes they don't have quite enough information to make it connect, and they just want to go look at something up. They're like, well, what was this person's name again? Oh, who was this person related to? And just being able to look at things lets them fill in the story details that they're missing. And that's even possible when they're not controlling anything at all. And you could imagine a game where they weren't controlling anything at all, and it still kind of works for emergent narrative. Legends mode is sufficient to have an emergent narrative game in some sense. Now, if the player is controlling everything, then you start to get into trouble. If the player could control every entity, every dwarf, tell them exactly what to do and control them somehow, then they're really just sort of writing a story, I guess in their head, of what they want to have happened, as if they were handwriting it themselves, but the game's not doing too much for them. Because we decided on this principle of Dwarven Autonomy when we were doing the Fortress mode of the game, that you get more emergent narrative when the dwarves are able to act with some initiative on their own. They act more like characters. They're more able to surprise you, rather than just allowing everything to be manually controlled. So, example of kind of the breadth of what we can allow here is back in the sculpture system, we set it up so that you can explicitly allow the dwarf to choose what's in the engraving. That's best for, you just want that dwarf to be able to express themselves. You want to be surprised. It's the default option, so you don't have to think about it. You can just throw down a bunch of engravings. The dwarves will come up with what they want. Now, if you want, you can also explicitly design piece by piece, and people do this quite a bit, because sometimes they want to express themselves in something like one of their inns or something. Maybe they have in their mind an image of what the symbol they want above this inn on the back wall, and they design it, place it back there. It saves that image that they named the Trustworthy Shield or whatever, and then they can put that where they want in their fortress. It might be the symbol of their fortress in their story, and so we allow that, and we allow a range of options related to a historical figure. If you want to have somebody's bedroom have an engraving that's related to one of their relatives or something, you could pick it and have them put it there. So there's a number of ways to sort of indirectly influence the action to get the story you want. This is just more instructions for how that engraving was formed. So you have these players going through the game, and they're experiencing it from these different perspectives, right? They might just be observing to write their story. They might be indirectly controlling things, or they could be the adventurer in the center of the action, being just ground up in these gears and producing a story. So this kind of this is where you have to sort of control the amount of exposition when we're talking about in the failed state of overwhelming the user with information. This is one of our ongoing failures in the game. When you look at a dwarf, we don't have tabs. Tabs were invented how many years ago, decades ago. That's something simple we could have done and have not done yet. We'll be doing that for the upcoming release, the Steam one. Just cleaning this up a little bit, but this is an example of a failure in the game. If you want to know something about this dwarf, you'd have to dig through this information. At the same time, this is the amount of information we need to have in the game for people to successfully tell stories, right? They need to be able to investigate this data here in order to fill in the blanks. Kind of more successfully, we have these forgotten beasts, right? There's this balance between having all the dwarves and elves and things that people recognize, and then wanting them to be surprised by a monster sometimes. So the kind of balance we've struck with that is having these monsters attack on occasion that are procedurally generated. This is some kind of huge winged gaunt worm with rosy feathers and deadly blood and so forth. And that just appears from the side of the screen, and then it does a little pop-up like this. Just so you know what you're dealing with, basically speaking. If it has deadly blood, you don't want to track that around everywhere if you can avoid it. Maybe spread some water to wash it away once it's dealt with. And that's been one of the most successful, I think, sort of engagements people have had with the game, is just drawing these things, right, spreading them around. And they happen in most stories that last sufficiently long. So just kind of reiterate what this sort of loop we're dealing with is when we're writing stories then. So the player's experiencing something in the game. It could be an alert, or they're just looking around, or the game actually stops and queries them and forces them to do something. Then, I mean, quite likely they just do something, write a story about it, so they were engaged with that mechanism, wrote it in. Or they thought of something they wanted to do themselves instead of being prompted. And that's cool. I mean, they did, you know, if you've got your engine humming, you'll be getting this quite a bit. And sometimes, if they were just observing, they just write something down. Oh, that cool happened. This thing came. The traders arrived. That kind of stuff. If it prompts them, something happened, and then they don't care. They just walk off and don't write a story. There's no quill there because they did not write it down. You don't want that to happen too often. It's going to happen though, and you just need your game to be able to kind of pick up and keep going. It works for us in real time in Fort mode just to keep rolling. But the kind of important one here that I wanted to highlight is this whole investigation idea. The fact that the player sees something, they start saying, okay, this is working in their internal story, but in order for them to continue that story, they want to slam pause or whatever and just go look around a little bit. And this is something that I think we can't really get enough of, as long as it's not like in people's faces and forcing them to take time out of their game if they don't want to take it out. But if you want to be able to fill in the blanks in stories, you can think about, you know, what when people are telling stories about my game, or when I'm playing it and thinking of stories in a project that's not released, like what's really missing from these stories, and what information can I provide in order to get people to just tell a little bit more, to make those stories more compelling. And if they can get at it, then they'll go find it, because people are really, you know, enthusiastic about telling stories when they're getting into it, and then they'll share them with people. So here's an example of that. The investigation of this relationship screen has some marginal use in terms of gameplay mechanics, but it's mostly just for people to be able to tell stories about who's friends with who and that kind of thing. Sometimes we don't have the ability to do more than just spit out a report, right? If you want to investigate something, you can go look at these combat reports. They're gruesomely over-detailed, not as kind of a salacious thing, but just when people want detail to tell these battle sequences or something, it's there. I mean, they can take the details they want and put them in their stories. You know, everything has been provided there. They won't, like when someone's telling a story about what happened to that wolf, they won't tell that entire story. Instead, they'll pick out the part that they want, and they'll go ahead and include that. And sometimes they'll just make stuff up, right? They will not understand the mechanic that was actually presented, or they won't care, and they'll just embellish their story. And this is another thing, kind of like the complexity in the procedural generation that people often say when they're talking about emergent narrative games, right? They say, well, the amazing power of the human mind to create stories is why we get these things. And that's true. But it's not something you can rely on, right? You need to, as hopefully we've seen in the talk to this point, you need to, it's something that you need to actively apply in the design of your project. But once you do get to that point, then this is great. Then people will be telling stories about it. And the only problem with this is when you have to, it gets to a critical mass and you have to say, well, no, sorry, that mechanic's not actually in the game. You just made that up. And other people get confused and so forth. But it's mostly cool. These narratives isn't just one story, right? You can set down the game, play another character, save it, go look at legends, go back to fortress mode, reclaim a fortress, retire a fortress and unretire it, retire an adventurer, go start another adventure, go talk to that adventurer, hire them into your party, move over, and all this kind of stuff you can do. And we've been throwing that stuff in because these perspective changes, right? These player role perspective changes we found are really interesting story hooks, and they get people into different aspects of the game. So it's something to consider. So when we're talking about the final bits that you need to think about building emergent narrative games, thinking about the player's role is very important. I mean, we think about the player in fortress mode as the official will of the fortress. And that framing has helped us come up with what sort of mechanics should be under player control and which ones shouldn't. And it's good to have a kind of clear idea of what exactly you think the player is, especially in these kind of strategy sort of games where there isn't just a character or something. And considering perspective changes, it's not necessary for a game, of course, but it's something that could surprise you and might be easier to do than you think to try something smaller, even if it's like Legends mode or something. Facilitating player investigation, as I've been kind of mentioning a few times, that's been something that we found works very well for us. And this whole idea of like trying to control the bandwidth of what you're shooting into the player's face, it's difficult. It's a very difficult problem, especially as the game gets more complicated. Which parts of the game are important to tell them, which ones aren't. That's a whole field basically of kind of game design. So difficult problem, but it's something that you'll need to be thinking about. So there's everything that I've kind of thought about. I mean, there's a lot more to say, obviously, but we're limited in time here. So I've kind of stamped your name on that, and like there's the list. But like this is always unsatisfying me to present like game design principles in a talk like this, because it doesn't really capture the things that we like about games. Like, is this game expressive? Does it provide a unique perspective? Did it jar us out of things in a good way rather than a bad one? And it's kind of my contention here is that this is actually a great way to do all of those things. You see things from different perspectives when you have these kind of procedural games, and the type of person you are and so forth lives within what you've added mechanically. It's all still wholesome and good. So that's it. That's the entire talk. I don't even know how long I took, but that's fun.
We've got time for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, okay.
When you notice stuff that you've described as something that like doesn't fit with the model of your simulation, like you described one of the systems where a dwarf would get rained on and then remember that for years. Do you ever, when you're like going in and fixing those holes, instead of like fixing them, just close them a little bit or like most of the way so that there's still a low percentage chance that a dwarf could get rained on and could completely change the course?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's reasonable. I mean, I have friends whose memories are like that. They're like, we'll call something incident that just has to do with the weather or something because they kind of keyed it that way. And I think that's kind of an extension too, is like if you have this memory, even if it was something terrible, you can still key it to something else that was going on, right? There's this kind of these kind of things that could live together in pairs or something would be another way to think about that. But another example there was beached whales. We had this whale beaching problem where the pathfinding was broken, and the whales would just kind of come up on the beach because they could breathe. I don't remember if it was because they could breathe through their heads or what. I don't remember anymore. They came up on the beach and were like, And that was just a pathfinding issue, but then when we closed the hole, we added a beaching percentage to certain aquatic creatures, right? And then we had the zombie whales, which kind of come up anyway or something like that. So yeah, no, you're always considering, and it's just a kind of a general thing in games too, when you're like, the bugs that people consider features, right? Then you're like, we got to keep it, but we've got to. The problem with simulation games and keeping bugs is that it's not good for the long-term health of the project to have something that you don't understand continuing to happen, right? So you need to go understand the bug, keep the parts you want to keep if you can, and then get rid of the parts that you don't understand or that are broken, and that happens quite a bit in terms of just keeping the thing going forward. And it's faster to keep stuff.
And so it seemed to me that like one of the ways to do that would be to take the bug and then incorporate it into the thing you were talking about with the layer of abstraction. Like if you can incorporate that thing that happened unintentionally into the abstraction and then make it rare enough that it's not like, oh, this thing that seems totally unnatural is happening all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Then like, because when you describe those things like the rain or the Tantrum Spiral, like those things to me were, oh, those are super interesting.
Yeah.
Those things are things that when they happen rarely are the things that I'd like to tell stories about.
Yeah, exactly. And with the Tantrum Spiral, right? And those things happen less often now. I think. There's this whole ongoing stress discussion right now on the forum, and we're working through that. But I don't think it relates to Tantrum Spiral specifically. But that kind of thing, like what we'd like to do is not have that be a bug that's coming out of a simple system, but there is a sort of contagion to distress, right? And that can be modeled. And then when you model that, you have to be really, really careful that it doesn't happen all the time. But it would be cool, I mean, to have like riots and things like that kind of spring up, and then that is another abstraction layer, exactly.
So when you were talking about mannerisms, it was like a detail of the characters that was generative and not tied into other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of, when people are making generators, they make generators for lots of details that are not related. Do you have a general word in the same way that we can refer to like Kate's bowls of oatmeal, things for like this phenomenon of there's a generated detail, it's not bad, but it's like a missed opportunity to have linked in with other things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big terminology guy. I just noticed that it's just superfluous or whatever. But I mean, it happens all the time. So it seems like the thing that should have a word.
It seems like, I would love to teach in my class if it had a nice word, but we
You can come up with the word. That's what you guys do, right? It just has been part of the practice for me. But for it's definitely a phenomenon, and as a phenomenon, it should have a name. And it probably does. I don't know.
I don't think so. Not yet.
Yeah, not well.
I assume more people have questions. But if you can just like repeat the questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
So I had a question just on finding errors, because in like a generative kind of game such as this one, it has an infinite space of possibilities. So how do you track down an error that might, or like a bug that might occur in there?
Okay, yeah, so the question is how to track down errors in games that are large and simulated and generated and all this kind of thing. And it depends on what we're going for. I mean, we do our common good practices of making sure you test every line of code, that kind of thing, right? And that gets you a certain amount of the way, right? I mean, it's working kind of how you expected, and that's nice. It's not crashing most of the time or whatever. You fix the problems that are kind of obvious and regular kind of programming problems. And then you've still got problems, right? Because you've got like, does this interact with every other system in the game? You kind of just try and it's not like everything interacts with everything, right? Things interact with a fairly small set of the set of things that can happen, and you do have to keep that perspective. You have to decide, like, I'm going to add a new hospital system to the game that's going to interact with the wounds, certain of the items, the hospital zone, and that's going to capture most of the rest, right? Just trying to keep the perspective, and then you test those things. And then you're wrong. That's what happens. You release it, and somebody finds something with the vampires or something in your new hospital thing that completely breaks the game. And then you fix it. I mean, it's really, we call our players are basically coworkers, and the people that watch YouTube videos are the players or something like that, right? It has gotten to the point where it doesn't feel like a one-person, two-person job. And I don't know if there's better practices there. It seems like it is an intractable problem without a bunch of people just messing around with it. Yeah.
What is the most notable example of like a couple systems interacting in a very unexpected way? Maybe something to do with alcohol and cats.
Okay. So yeah, that would have been my answer. So yeah, the question is what is the most kind of unexpected way that two systems had acted together with a shout out for the cat alcohol bug. I don't want to bore everybody to death. How many people know about the cat alcohol thing? Okay, so that's not very many people, right? So that's less than half the people. So the quick-ish synopsis is that I went on the bug tracker one day, and this is exactly the like the previous question, right? You're like, you get a report on the bug tracker that says there are a bunch of dead cats in cat vomit in my tavern help, and so we thought at first that the dwarves were like getting into fist fights with the cats because they were drunk or something, because that would cause like the combat things to happen. Now, of course, this wasn't correct because there weren't like pieces of cats or anything like that. It was literally just vomit. There was no blood. Okay, fine. So people investigated this with us it was like a 3-day project of people looking through stuff, and we have a bunch of like memory hacker people and stuff now looking through these things. And eventually, it turned out that they had blood alcohol poisoning, right? The cats did. And I mean, it could happen theoretically. I mean, there's no osmosis or something in the game, so the cats are getting the alcohol into their system somehow. And what it turned out to be is that the cats would like there'd be a dwarf in the bar. The dwarf would order a drink it, have to run off to a job, and when they run off to a job, they empty their inventories because they may need to use a pick or do something, right? So they just pitch the cup on the floor. That triggers the spilling, and the spilling gets because it likes to empty containers when it drops them in fort mode, because a full container, if it's not like a storage item, it just causes problems, right? So we empty all the crap out of there. So the alcohol gets on the floor. The cats come in, they get tracked, they track through the alcohol, and the alcohol gets on their paws, right? And so now so at least we've got alcohol in contact with the cat now, which is progress. But then what happened after that was there was this other problem that we had in the game, like when people get blood spattered on them, but especially when it would just rain outside, it would get every part of their body wet, right? And so that included like their eyelids and their eyeballs, right? And so you would go to their inventory and go to the spatter at the bottom of the inventory, and it would be like right eyelid, water covering, right eye, water covering. And it's like, it seems kind of stupid. And especially when they're in their fights too, and it's like right eye has blood in it or whatever, when it just came from somewhere else or something. And you're like, well, that's not how it works. And so how you fix this problem is you make eyelids clean the eye, right? That's how you do it, right? And so now that works, and it cleans, as long as you have an eyelid, it'll clean your eye. And then what we did then, and this is just the kind of random thing, is like, okay, we've got this body cleaning function, and we're kind of cat obsessed. If you've played the game, they hunt little animals and bring them back, do all kinds of cat stuff, right? So we made the cats lick themselves and clean themselves, right? And that, when you clean yourself with a mouth part, it triggers the ingestion routine. That was just another detail that we caught. It's this thing where like again in the previous question, when you're adding new systems, you try and think of what relates to them, right? So when we add the cleaning, we're like, oh, mouth parts, okay, ingestion, right? And it's just a lucky catch, right? And so now the cats all die because they lick the alcohol off of their paws and they ingest the alcohol. That still doesn't answer the question, but the thing was, when we did it with the mistake, the one error in this whole process was when the cats ingest the alcohol, we just put a placeholder number because we're like, this is not going to happen, this whole cleaning, who cares, right? So we just put in the placeholder number, and it's a mug, right? So they lick their paw and they just throw one back. And it's like human mug sized, right? And they're tracking through this stuff constantly, so it's like track and lick as they're like going through this pathfinding routine. They'll be on their 10th or 12th mug by the time they get across the small tavern. And it goes through the whole alcohol syndrome then, because we had that all modeled right through the 6 stages up until respiratory failure, and they didn't make it. So yeah, we just fixed it by changing that one number, and it was fixed. But it takes a long time. It's very aggravating fixing bugs in these games. You just have to get used to it. I don't know. If you don't like debugging, it's something you need to learn to like. Just pretend you're a detective or something, and it's okay. Yeah. Any more questions?
I've got questions.
When you worked on a project for this long, and you kind of have your own dedicated fan base, how do you balance coming up with your own ideas and implementing those as opposed to ideas from the community that you think are good?
Yeah, no, it's a hard thing to do, and I've maintained. Oh, sorry. The question is that how do we balance player suggestions versus our own ideas in a project that's been going on for this long, where we have a suggestion board with tens of thousands of ideas on it now, I think, like separate threads that are ideas, and we read them. We read them all, and I mean, we maintain a certain amount of selfishness, which I guess they call the vision of the game or whatever, right? And so, you know, I want to do like procedural magic systems at some point in the next 3 years, and so I'm going to do it, right? Assuming the Steam release goes on schedule and everything, then I'm just going to go do that because I've been waiting for 5 years or whatever. And so that's how that happens, but that's pretty broad. And then when people make tons of little suggestions about things, I mean, oftentimes they're targeting an issue in the game, and their idea is not great, but the issue they're targeting is something that's very important. And so you get into this point where oftentimes you'll find like this middle ground between your favorite way of solving what's a real problem in the game. And so it often works together like that. And that's a way to keep yourself motivated about it, because if you're just doing other people's stuff, I mean, it's like having a regular kind of game job or something, right? And that's cool, but it's like it's not what I'm in it for. So, but I think you can get a long way satisfying their kind of core concerns and still implement your own stuff. It's kind of the feel I've had so far.
More questions?
This is kind of a random question, but how did you choose the font for the game?
Okay, so the question is, how do we choose the font for the game? That's IBM code page 437. It was just MS-DOS when I grew up. I just used the one I grew up with. So yeah, that's it. Just those were my smiley faces, the ones that I grew up with, and I drew a beard on them in the font for the full screen font. That was my only contribution to the font, was defacing the MS-DOS font. And I'm not sure what we're going to do in Steam, because we have the opportunity and perhaps necessity of going with some variable width font or something. And at that point, I don't know. I'm not a big font person, but we need to figure that out. And yeah, things may change. Or maybe we'll stick with it. Who knows?
Got a question back there.
Can we take a silly question?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
I've noticed that looking through Legends mode, the elves keep eating people.
Yes.
Why is that?
Okay, so the question is, why do elves eat people in Dwarf Fortress? So yeah, it was one of the details from one of the stories my brother wrote, and in that case, and I think there's other things like this, but that would be the one I can think of. The story led the feature creation. He was kind of fascinated with the idea that they were more natural, like animals, and ate people and stuff, and they ate the things they killed like they were preying upon them. They don't eat other people, right? They just eat them in the army battles and so forth. And I mean, we're kind of fascinated with the thought of putting that in the fort mode sieges. It might be a bit much if they start eating your dwarves, but you know, you'd have like this combat report, and you'd pull up the blow by blow of what they were eating at the time. It would be the data that we have to work, because in the butchery shop, like we have the body, right, and the body is this tree, and it has defined what tissues are missing and what wounds are on the tissues and so forth, and we had to set it up at some point just to track the right amount of materials, that when you're in the butcher shop and they take like a cow that perhaps is damaged to the butcher shop, they will essentially be doing combat actions to take pieces of it off to get the right amount of meat and so forth, right? And this ties into the elves consuming people, because I can't imagine doing it any other way, and that would be bad, but it would be graphic. But that seems like the likely future. Sadly. Are there any other? Oh, do you? Okay.
Running question I've had for like 2 years.
Yeah, you can find it somewhere if you look through my brother's posts on the forum. I believe you can find the genesis of the elf eating people in some like 2009 thread or something like that. I don't remember when they started eating people, but it was very old, and it's there. There's a record of almost everything.
Okay, if no one else has one right now, I've got one. Did somebody else? Okay. So recently we had a programming assignment where everybody did basically like an infinite world generation. People came up with a whole bunch of different like creative ways to approach it. But you've got like a world and terrain generator in your game, and it's got like a bunch of different layers on it. Can you like walk us through what some of those layers are and what operations they're doing, like for the noise and what all?
Yeah. So the question is how world generation works, the maps in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And my stuff is very, very simple in terms of like not using anything fancier than like midpoint displacement type stuff, because we noticed that like every generator has artifacts, right? Like Perlin noise is roundy at first if you do the naive implementation, and then you can kind of work with it to make it more like what you want. A midpoint displacement just kind of looked right. It has horizontal and vertical artifacts, and I guess you can use diamond square to get rid of some of those. We don't even do that because there's so much erosion and stuff that happens. We still have some of that, but we've just been lazy. So that's the initial elevation, temperature, rainfall, and drainage pass is to do 4 different midpoint displacement maps, and then they're just sitting there. The temperature map is biased by whatever poles you've set up in your parameters, and the other ones are just what they are. And then at the next stage, I believe I'll just be skipping stuff and I'll be forgetting stuff or whatever. But once you put those together, you get the kind of the biomaps. We don't have that yet. We take does the rain shadow come? The rain shadow must come first. So we have the elevations. We have prevailing winds, which is very simple right now, just west, east, west. There's this cool Twitter project. I don't remember what it's called. Was it called Ecosphere, Sphere, something or whatever? It has really cool wind maps. Mm-hmm. We don't have that. We have just these kind of west, east things. That sets up the rainfall falling on one side of the mountain and deserts on the other side. It makes it just look a little more consistent. And every little thing we can throw in, especially not the big mountain ranges, but just the fact that a hill could be drier on one side, makes the rainfall maps look way less fractal, and it gives us all those little variations. That was a really good thing to stumble into there with that effect. And once you have the rainfall map set up, you're still just dealing with these one big fractal map, or one big fractal field without subdivisions. Excuse me. And then we do the river simulation. River simulation, it runs 10,000 times first just to erode channels toward the ocean, just kind of doing random walks down the edges of the mountain, smearing them out. And then there's this whole kind of big walk back up from the oceans to set up all of the water tables. You have all these arrows pointing, so every single water table, I don't remember what the names are of each different basin or whatever. There's some name for it. Just kind of the triangular shaped thing that goes from the mouth of a river out into all of its little dendrite little fingers. And you can imagine the entire world of being made up of just those, right? Pretty much. There's some weird things that happen with rivers that disappear and come back and all kinds of weird stuff. But in Dwarf Fortress, no. Everything's just rivers come up. And then once you've got those things set up, then you can do a pass back down and calculate the depth or the amount of flow through each river based on the total rainfall in the basin. And then you get the big wide Amazon type rivers in the bigger basins. Like if you have a whole Amazon type basin, it'll be way thicker down at the bottom. And it interacts with desert rainfall appropriately, so it doesn't get too much thicker in those areas and stuff like that. And then you've got that set up on the map. And then it does a kind of lake filling routine. There's not a real great way for us to do lakes right now, so I just pick some points and kind of says this place is a little flatter or whatever, and spreads out some lake-looking things. That may be, there's this whole thing with the elevation where a fractal elevation doesn't look right. So there was some point where we bowed the elevation in kind of a quadratic-y type way to Dwarf Fortress has some ridiculously, strangely shaped peaks that we're going to fix later because there's these little spires that come up, but mostly that works to give us some flatter, planey type things, and then the mountains look a lot better. That also gets rid of some of the artifacting from the original fractals. So I think that's everything you need to get the basic fields up in the map. Then you've got the biomes you can set, and this is at this point, once we've got those 4 fields are now locked down. Once those 4 fields are locked down, we have biomes, and the way that I described in the talk, right? The 4 things come together, you get the biomes, and now when you have biomes, you can just flood fill out through every square, and now I know where the forest is. I can give it a name. I know where these things are, and not just a name, and the naming isn't important. It's the biome exists as an entity, and that's saved as something called a subregion. And subregions get the flora, fauna type definition so that they're different from each other. They're distinct from each other. The types of trees are set up appropriate for the biome. There's something like 20-something biome types, like temperate, broadleaf forest that just interacts with the rainfall and temperature and stuff correctly. And so all those subdivisions get set up. And the geology right now, sadly, does not interact with any of this. It's just these flood lumps that get lumped out over 10 to 20 squares each and stacked 10 deep. Just kind of splattered out there in something that does not look at all attractive or interesting. Later, we'll link that to the drainage, and then suddenly we'll have the right type of karst terrain and all that kind of cool stuff. Not now. But those geology layers by themselves are interesting just in that each one gets a primary stone type, and then it goes through all of the files and linkages and stuff to get everything in its proper environment locally within that without understanding it as some kind of geological process, which we'd like to get to later, of course, doing like those big batholiths that come up and all that kind of stuff. That's all doable in this kind of way of thinking about the geology layers and just a little bit better, then we can do some cool stuff, but not now. And that gets you to, probably gets you to history generation. I'm not sure if I'm missing any major details of things, but at that point it would just plop down a bunch of locations, including the caves. The caves don't have anything to do with the geography right now, and except being more in mountains or whatever, in a kind of fantasy way. And then it just plops down sites and so forth, and then that side of the map, I'm not sure if you're interested in that generation. That's a whole different ballgame.
Yes, but that's a different
Yeah,
question.
that's a different question. But then there's the question of, there's also the play area and mid-level map question, which is more related to that. But those things, all the mid-level structures, like when I lay down the rivers, I talk about those crossing points and all that, and those are set in world generation, but they're not used. Like there's no cause to use them yet. Mostly because in history generation, it needs to know exactly what materials and so forth the different civilizations have access to, and occasionally it will pop up that information to see like, oh, is the river crossing through here, and that kind of stuff or whatever, just on occasion, but mostly not. When you actually go to play the game, then it starts pulling up these kind of mid-level map structures, these kind of 16 by 16 blocks that is one of those map tiles. And that contains a bunch of information about exactly where the river flows and has a little fractal map of its own. But I wanted a little playground that I could use there so that I could just change it, right? I could make more interesting geography. I could do whatever I want in the little playground. And then each of those playground squares is a 48 by 48. For some reason, I don't know, 64 would be much more natural, but I just ended up, it's just a legacy thing, I'm stuck with 48 by 48. Actual play tile area. So a fort will typically be a 4 by 4 on the mid-level map, which is a 16th of a world tile, but that ends up being a 192 by 192 play space, unless I screwed something up. And that's, but those generation things are, it's all still midpoint displacement stuff or whatever, but with a lot of post-processing.
So you described a bunch of these kind of intermediate data structures that are used. Do you, as the developer, dump those out to files that you visualize somehow else, or are you sort of debugging it through almost the same display that the players have?
Oh no, I have. I may be able to.
Like I'm wondering what sort of extra views you have for debugging purposes.
Well, the thing is, once you make an extra view for debugging purposes, there's no reason that you shouldn't share it with the players. There we go. And I don't know how fast I can fire one of these up. Does this game run? I don't know what I was last doing here. I always keep a copy of it on this. So hopefully I have a Legends world I can pop up here quickly. Now the thing is, I didn't write this. This might change in the Steam version or not. There's a lot of things we'd want to do in the Steam version we're not going to have time for. But in this case, where it says export detailed map, then I can do the standard biome map. I don't know how big this world is, so this might be counting up to 17 or 255.
So this is dumping a bunch of
This
files in the file system that you want to
Yeah, this is just dumping into the folder, and I get, or it's dumping into. Is it drawing in memory now? And we'll dump. And this is well, now we crossed the 33. That means 65's next. Oh, it's going faster. It must be getting near the end, right? Or it's actually going through a place that's not civilized, because the civilized parts are a lot harder to draw. Come on, stop. Nope. Come on. All right, come on, little buddy. I would not do a large world. It's got to be medium. It's got to be 127. Why would I bother making a large world? There was absolutely no reason to do a large world. Come on, it's just 17 more then, right?
Well, while those are dumping out, a related thing is that is there basically like one main function that launches the entire game that you're using, or are there many different tools that you build for yourself for?
I have a whole lot of debugging. The biggest tool I've got for debugging, actually, that's not public because it's practically a game mode, and it would need to have that level of, like, I don't have a lot of polish, but there's a certain standard, right? So it's the debugging world where you're kind of like a crystal ball, and you can run through the mid-level adventure mode travel map, but you're just looking around, and you can pass time. And then you can see like a city, and then you can zoom in, and then you're like looking at the play area of the city, but then you can just pop back. So you're just kind of like some kind of god in the world looking around. But then you can use the look cursor and press enter and manifest as a person, and then just start talking to people. And it'd be cool, right? It's a cool play mode, and it would just need to be worked on. So it looks like we should have our file somewhere. Where's my little file? So this is what the players get for debugging, and this is based on, this is pixel by pixel correct for the mid-level map. It looks like I ran a large world with no history in it. Oh, here's it. So this is those must be hobbit towns. Are these are some kind of goblin-y town? I'm looking for just a little human civilization. Come on, anybody got better eyes than I do? Man. All right. Well, in any case, I have no idea what I was testing here, but I was obviously testing something abnormal. Well, I saw some roads. So here's some tunnels in the mountains. So here's dwarf fortresses all through the mountains, and this is the exact size of them. Each one of these dots is one of the actual 48 by 48 blocks, and if you pick a rectangle, that's a big fat one, isn't it? Oops. If you pick a 16 by 16... that is one world map tile, and so this works out. And people have done all kinds of mods and things that play with this. There's a whole Legends mode, Legends Viewer, I think it's called, is the best kind of Legends mode, most comprehensive Legends mode mod that uses stuff like this and just shows you everything that's going on in the histories and all graphical. So it's cool. So yeah, and then there's the other tools, and then I've got tool that I use in play, where the I don't know what I'm pulling up here, but the just putting it back to the talk slides, but the in play in Fortress mode, I have a little debug tool I pop up that pops up a menu that lets me create items and stuff that you might imagine is handy. In a dwarf thing, but it's also got really specific tools like just dropping a boulder on someone, because very often you need to test the hospital or whatever. So I've got hospital testing functions and all kinds of other weird stuff like that. That it just turned out that I didn't want to write it 3 or 4 times, so I just kept it around, and now it's a very specific, strange option. And there are about 50 of those, just weird little things like that. Yeah.
I want to know the reasoning behind why you keep the graphics as text-based, like Caves of Cud type of style, and not try to go for like a graphical interface.
Yeah, so the question is, why are the graphics text-based, and why aren't we going for the graphical interface? So I guess the short answer is that we're going to a graphical interface, but when we do the Steam release, but the kind of historical reason is it's faster development for us, and we had a lot to do, and I think CUD actually found a good middle ground, because that is a graphical interface, but it's very sparse, right?
Yeah.
But they are drawn, right? It's actually, it looks nice for what they're going for in that game, and we probably would have been better served having that. Although, I mean, yeah, the whole code page 437 thing holds a certain sort of nostalgia, and probably pulled some people in with us too. So, it's hard to guess between the different styles.
Somebody had something?
When does the Steam version come out?
So the question is, when does the Steam version come out? We haven't even finished the Villains release that was promised to the people before that, which in the end is a strange prioritization for us, but we're going to finish that as soon as we can, and then hoping getting out next year sometime. Yeah, it was really hard to say because we haven't started yet.
So when you created this project, what was the intention? It seems like, especially through this talk, I don't know if this is the case, that one of the intentions behind the project is that it would create an experience that somebody would want to tell a story about. Was that the original intention behind creating the project?
Yeah, so the question is, was the original intention of Dwarf Fortress to create a storytelling engine, basically? And the answer is yes. We've been doing, my brother and I have been doing kind of, it really was more in the RPG space, but we had these games ever since I was like, I don't know, 11 or 12 or something. The first one was called Drag Slay for Dragon Slayer, because we had 8 letters available to us at the time, right, for naming stuff. And it was an RPG with a procedurally generated map, and we just noticed at that point, we had been playing roguelikes and stuff, but also things like Starflight and stuff that had these whole generated worlds. And so we were thinking like, oh, if you generate a world and then play a roguelike in it, basically you're going to have all kinds of, it's going to be fun, basically, is how we were conceptualizing it at the time. But then we started talking about what was happening in our games, and sometime around, I was 15 or 16, we started passing this notebook back and forth. We would write chapters of what might happen in the game. And then we just started using that as a design tool, and it worked really well. And that's kind of when we stumbled into this whole idea of how to actually, because we had been telling each other roguelike stories. That was kind of probably what we saw as our initial emergent narrative games that we were playing. It's like the whole Yet Another Stupid Death thing, right, is a roguelike staple on forums, right, the YASDs or whatever. And it grew out of that. And so this is really the 4th generation of that, right? There was Drag Slay, there was Slaves to Armagh, God of Blood, which we released, and then another version of that, or another Drag Slay, depending on how you're counting. And then this. And this was originally a side project while we were working on Slaves to Armagh, God of Blood, which is still online. It's just terrible. But that was going to be a big story engine RPG. And we just were thinking about it in exactly the wrong way, because we didn't know how to scale up our ambitions properly and didn't have the advice from the slides here ingrained quite deeply enough. We were still just letting projects run into the ground and die. And Dwarf Fortress is really the first long project we've had where that hasn't happened. And it feels like it's still going, so it feels like we finally figured this out, how to keep a long project running. But I mean, it wasn't always our fault in the beginning. Like the original Drag Slay died because we didn't know how to get a thing to load more than 65,000 lines of code in one of these old Borland compilers or something, right? It was just these numeric restrictions. would hit us, and we kind of outgrew the computers we were on, or at least our technical knowledge in terms of how to link files together. There's probably some way architecturally to do it back then, and we just didn't have any resources. And then eventually the computers got big enough, and it started becoming our own fault again more, and we figured that out to this point to some extent. It seems to be going kind of okay, but there are still problems like frames per second deaths of fortresses and so forth, which are obviously like not good and are a technical hurdle that we have not gotten by. And yeah, how to solve that problem is it's a difficult problem without being able to throw a lot of money at it or something. I don't know.
Okay. We're gonna have to wrap up here, but we'll have like discussion outside of class. But I just wanted to like ask one last question. So if you do have more questions, hang on to them, and we'll talk about them afterwards. But one last question. You mentioned midpoint displacements a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Can you give us like a brief explanation of how that works?
Yeah, so midpoint displacement is a fractal routine you probably shouldn't use because diamond square is always better, I think, or something. But the basic idea of midpoint displacement is you've got the four corners of your grid. You pick the four edge points that connect those corners and just average and wiggle the corners. Take two corners, pick the edge, wiggle it, average and wiggle. So it's basically the midpoint. Both in terms of the value, like if the elevation one is high, one is low, then this would be the middle elevation, but you wiggle it with the variance number you set yourself, right? So that leads to what because if you had no variation, you just get a smooth average, and you just end up with a smooth looking plane with some folds in it, because there'd be some crisp folds, kind of like when you do four quads four triangles make a quad or whatever with a center point. But you if you wiggle, then it starts to look more like terrain or something. But the last stage of this is once you get your four edge points, then you have your center point. It's a average of all four edge points wiggled, and then now it's a recursive algorithm. I've divided my space into four squares or rectangles or whatever, and you just call it again, and you get the result. Huge vertical and horizontal artifacting comes out of this because it obviously prefers those directions. And part of diamond square is, shifting that a little bit, so you toss it up a little bit. I don't have enough experience with that to know how much it really fixes the problems or not. And then, obviously, Perlin noise, you get different types of issues, and it's a completely different algorithm.
What do you mean by wiggle?
Oh, sorry. So if my elevation and the top left corner is 30, and my elevation in the top right corner is 10. Then at the edge, I'm going to place 20, which is the average of 30 and 10. But then I have a variance variable, which will make it plus or minus 5. So I'm wiggling it up and down, is what I mean by wiggle. And then the important thing is you use that same variance at all of the edges. You use that same variance at the center. But when you recurse, you divide the variance by 2. So that you're varying. Your wiggles are less, then your wiggles are less. Otherwise, you just get a jagged mess.
Okay.
Anybody who still wants to ask questions, we can talk more outside. But that's I think the official line. So let's all thank Tantrum for coming in.
I'm not. That's not the clip. Ball picking. Okay.